Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for including me in this. I think the topic of traditional ecological knowledge is very interesting, and I'm still new to the subject. In fact, the topic I'm talking about today is probably only marginally related to TEK, so I warned Chris about that, but he thought it would make for a nice closing because I think it's relevant. The story of what's happening in the Klamath right now is definitely relevant for people who are interested in applications of TEK, because I think it's a great illustration of the growing role that indigenous peoples and tribes in the United States and the American West in particular are playing in restoration efforts, and are playing an increasingly important role in natural resource management decision making using not just TEK but also SEK, scientific ecological knowledge. And so the role, the increasingly powerful role that the Klamath tribes in particular have been playing in events taking place there recently, I think is exciting and indicative of some interesting power shifts going on, not only in the Klamath but all around the West and the world, I'll argue. So as the title suggests, I'm going to focus on the role that indigenous sovereignty and the federal tribal trust responsibility have played in catalyzing these innovative new approaches to resource management in the Klamath. And as I said, I think the Klamath case study exemplifies a significant power shift in tribal, non-tribal relations taking place not only in the Klamath but around the world. And in the Klamath, this shift is being catalyzed in large part by the Klamath tribe's hunting and fishing treaty rights, which entitle them legally to most, if not all, of the water in the basin for in-stream flow for two endangered fish, which you see here with two tribal women around 1900. And those rights have long been ignored, but for a number of reasons, they're playing a much more important role now. And as the former chairman of the Klamath tribes states here, there's rectification that has to be done, and without that part of it, this basin isn't going to move ahead. So, as many of you know, the Klamath Basin has gotten a lot of attention over the past decade or so, due mostly to the enormity of the conflict there between irrigated ag and endangered species and tribal interests, commercial fisheries, but it's also gotten a lot of attention more recently for these historic agreements that were signed just a couple months ago in Salem. The two major agreements that are important here are the Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement, which is going to lead to what if it all comes to pass as it should in 2020, will be the largest dam removal project in the history of the world. And then in tandem with that is the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, which is a basin-wide comprehensive approach to social ecological restoration. So these two agreements are really historic, really exciting, and I started out doing research in the Klamath focusing on the role that little small place-based bottom-up collaborative groups were playing in changing social relations in the basin. And while I was there, this KBRA process was starting to take place, and so I became really interested in that and understanding that and trying to explain that. So trying to figure out what are the causal mechanisms that have led the basin to make this dramatic shift from intense conflict to some pretty historic collaboration and movement towards restoration. So I think what's especially notable about the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement is that it's not just about the environment. It's got a lot more to it. It's got these social factors, these economic factors. In terms of the social factors, it's going to address persistent social conflict between groups and interests, including state and federal government, basin tribes, coastal commercial fishing interests, irrigated agricultural groups, and environmental organizations. Economics, it's going to address the loss of subsistence, tribal and commercial fisheries, persistent poverty among tribal groups, regulatory and water delivery uncertainty for irrigated ag, loss of preferential power contracts supporting ag, and then, of course, ecologically, a major focus of the KBRA will be to resolve problems of water quantity, water quality, fish passage, and habitat functionality and loss associated with land conversion, irrigation diversions, and, of course, the dams, the hydropower operations. So it's much more than dam removal. It's much more than just restoring endangered fish for the tribes. It really addresses a whole suite of issues, and it's a lot of every group in the basin has had to experience some sacrifice, and there's some a sharing of the winning and the wins and losses. So the way I look at the Klamath Basin and try to explain what's going on there is I think of it as in terms of three prongs, three major things going on that are responsible for recent changes. And the first is just this background legal framework that's been there for a really long time. Tribal trust responsibility has been there since the mid-1800s, and with the Klamath Treaty in 1864. The Endangered Species Act has been around since the 1970s, the Federal Power Act since the 1950s. So these laws have been around for quite some time, and so they provide the background. But the laws in and of themselves were never enough, have not been enough to resolve any conflicts there. And so one of the big things that a lot of people credit there right now is this very interesting forum that emerged around the dam relicensing process. It's called the FERC relicensing process, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which has to do with the dams on the Klamath River have to be, like all privately held dams, have to be relicensed every 50 years, and they have to comply with the environmental laws that are in place at that time. So the dams on the Klamath had to go through relicensing and had to comply with current laws, including the Endangered Species Act. So it required all the different parties from the basin to come together and talk about the dams. But what happened is that those conversations grew to include topics much more than just the dams. And it led to the formation of this Klamath Settlement Group. So the fact that there was finally a forum that brought everyone together was critical. And it's just simply, in many ways, a matter of geography. This is such a huge basin that people hadn't really ever had occasion to come together and talk to the people that they needed to talk to in order to sort out a basin-wide solution. So I think that the FERC relicensing process is a really interesting piece of this to look more closely at. And then also, I think critical to this, and this is the part that I find most interesting as a social scientist who does qualitative research, is the role that the improved social relations between tribal and non-tribal interests played in establishing new alliances and new relationships, and the role that rectification amongst individuals played in moving events forward is very interesting. So I'll try to get to some of that in here. But I think for the purposes of this group, I think you'd especially be interested. I really think that the tribal trust responsibility is one of the most significant drivers of recent change, even though it was, it's been around since the mid-19th century, but in many ways it hasn't really been realized until now. And so just to let you know a little bit more, some of you I'm sure are very familiar with this already, but it's a pretty exciting piece of law in the United States. And it's the source of tribal sovereignty, which tribal sovereignty refers to the inherent authority of indigenous tribes to govern themselves as sovereign nations and demand accountability from the U.S. government to fulfill its trust responsibilities. And quoted here in a secretarial order having to do with the Endangered Species Act and the Tribal Trust Responsibility, this is a nice summary. A unique and distinctive political relationship between the United States and Indian tribes is defined by treaties, statutes, executive orders, judicial decisions, and agreements, and differentiates tribes from other entities that deal with or are affected by the federal government. So tribes can negotiate with the federal government in a way that states or irrigation districts or farmers or ranchers or even politicians can. The tribes have this special relationship with the federal government. This relationship has given rise to a special federal trust responsibility involving the legal responsibilities and obligations of the U.S. toward Indian tribes and the application of fiduciary standards of due care with respect to Indian lands, tribal trust resources, which of course include their fisheries, and the exercise of tribal rights. And so these rights have existed since the treaty era, but for much of the late 19th and early 20th century, they weren't recognized or adhered to. And I think what we're seeing in the Klamath is a greater recognition of these rights, especially as they relate to water resources. So in the next few minutes, I'll lay out the history of the Klamath, which many of you probably know because it's been told many times, but about the history of how water has been allocated in the basin since the late 19th century and what it's meant for the tribes there. So just a little bit of orientation to the Klamath. The basin is on the border of Oregon and California. That's about 40,000 square kilometers combined. Upper Basin alone is as big as the state of Connecticut. And until the 20th century, much of the Upper Klamath Basin was comprised of wetlands surrounding Upper Klamath Lake and served as an important stopover on the Pacific Flyway. And historically, salmon migrated all the way up into the Klamath Basin from the Pacific Ocean to the tributaries above Upper Klamath Lake. But in 1918, the TEK021 dam was put in right around the Oregon-California border, and that blocked passage. So there haven't been salmon in the upper basin for almost 100 years. So, and also the Upper Basin has been home to the Klamath tribes for their territory. It's been their territory for thousands of years. But in 1864, with the treaty, the Klamath Treaty, they relinquished millions of acres to white settlers, reserved only about 1 million acres for themselves, and lived on that, and did quite well, actually. They're one of the most prosperous tribes in the country up until termination in the 1950s, which I think you heard a little bit about termination earlier. But in 1954, they lost their reservation and their tribal status, like many other tribes in the United States. And the termination policy, again, was based on this idea that tribes would do better as American citizens, and they didn't need to have this special tribal status anymore. Well, so all that land went to farmers and ranchers mostly, all that good agricultural land, and the tribes have no homeland, even though their tribal status was reinstated in 1986. So now they are back to being tribes, the Klamath tribes, with that same tribal trust relationship with the federal government, but they do not have any land. So that's been a sore point for a long time. The Upper Basin is also home to a number of close-knit agricultural communities, which are largely dependent on the water in the Klamath Basin for irrigation of alfalfa and higher value crops, including potatoes and horseradish and onions and mint. And then the lower basin is different, very different geographically. Below Upper Klamath Lake, the Klamath River flows past the 4 hydroelectric dams that are slated for removal and into the lower basin, where it's joined by the Scott and the Salmon and the Trinity rivers, and empties into the Pacific Ocean right near Crescent City. And it's mostly rugged, temperate rainforest and home to 3 salmon fishing tribes, the Yurok, Karuk, and Hoopa Valley tribes. And the lower basin is well known for the fact that it was once the 3rd most productive salmon. Well, the Klamath River in general was once the 3rd most productive salmon river system in the lower 48, but the habitat-blocking dams and poor water quality and insufficient flows have reduced the salmon population to less than 10% of its historic size. So that's a problem not only for the 3 salmon fishing tribes down there, but also for the white communities in the lower Klamath Basin that depend on commercial and recreational fishing for their economies. So, all right, so one way to understand what's happening in the Klamath is to look at how water has been over-promised and over-allocated since the mid-19th century when European Americans first settled there. So one way you can look at this is that in 1864, with the treaty with the Klamath tribes, the tribes relinquished land, but they retained their hunting and fishing treaty rights. And what that meant, later on, the courts ruled, is that they had the right not only to fish, but they had the right to enough water to support those fish that they hunt for. So the Supreme Court determined not till much later, so these rights have existed since the mid-1800s, but they weren't really explicitly stated as water rights until much later in the 1970s. But their rights go back to time immemorial, and they're the most senior water rights in the basin, and they are therefore they're senior to the irrigators that came later. So 1860s, settlers came and under the state prior appropriation doctrine started diverting water, and without any concern for the water that had been reserved for the tribes for their fish. And so that started some more water coming out of the system for the irrigation that took place in the off-project lands up above Klamath Lake and the Wood, the Williamson, and the Sprague rivers. And then some more water was promised through the establishment of the National Wildlife Refuges. The Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge was the first, I think, in the United States, established in 1908. Terrific bird habitat on the Pacific Flyway. So implicitly, it was in this establishing this refuge was the promise of water to maintain the bird habitat. And then in 1910, one of the earliest Bureau of Reclamation projects, the Klamath Irrigation Project, was established. And for this project, they drained the wetlands and the swamps for farming, for potatoes, alfalfa, mint, horseradish, and created infrastructure to divert water from Upper Klamath Lake. So that currently serves about 1,400 irrigators. And now you can see how the system is starting to get a little bit overtaxed. You're supposed to have water in stream for the fish. Now you've got water being diverted for ranching in the off-project lands, water for farming in the Bureau of Reclamation Project. There's the Wildlife Refuge. Well, then the dams go in, and now there's water that's needing to be diverted through the dams for hydropower, for cheap electricity for the farmers on the project. And so the water needs to be managed in ways that make sense for the dam, for the COPCO, Pacific Corps. And then this is a really important piece of the history, is in 1988, when the two fish species that are very important to the Klamath tribes, they're tribal, they're treaty species, the Lost River and the short-nosed suckers, were listed in 1988 under the Endangered Species Act. And so this is one of the most powerful laws we have on the books in the United States, and what it says is that any federal action must not further jeopardize an endangered species. So that might seem very simple, but what it means is that anytime you want to operate a dam or anytime the Bureau of Reclamation, which is a federal agency, wants to make a change to its dam operations or to its irrigation infrastructure, it has to comply with the Endangered Species Act. So in many ways, 1988 ESA comes along, that takes priority over, technically, legally, over everything else going on in the basin. But, and then in 1997, the coho salmon in the lower basin were listed as threatened. So upper basin, 2 endangered fish species, lower basin, you've got a threatened fish species. And what this led to was a tremendous lack of coordination. You've got the Fish and Wildlife Service managing the endangered species in the upper basin, the National Marine Fisheries Service managing the species in the lower basin, the Bureau of Reclamation in the middle trying to get enough water for the irrigators, and just a big mess with increasing stress around not enough water for everyone to satisfy everyone's needs, especially in times of drought. So I just want to point out that the Endangered Species Act in and of itself is really powerful and scary and can stop all kinds of things and all kinds of development in its tracks. But when you add to it the fact that these 2 species are tribal trust species, treaty species, it really puts the ESA almost on steroids, if you want to think of it that way, because now, because of the tribal trust arrangement, the tribes have the right to intervene in any kind of consultations between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Reclamation, for example, when they're consulting about how to implement the Endangered Species Act. The tribes have the right to intervene and be there during those meetings and influence the way that the ESA is implemented. So in that sense, the tribal trust responsibility enables the tribes to have access to the kind of decision-making this kind of decision-making in a way that the irrigators do not have access to, or other entities. And that's only starting to become more and more realized in the 80s and 90s, this tribal trust responsibility. Before that, there really wasn't anyone asking the tribes what they thought about sucker species or water management or where the water should go. So in many ways, this is just a big mess, a lot of people fighting, lots of social conflict, especially in times of drought. So the big drought, there had been periods of drought throughout the second half of the 20th century, but the big one came in 2001, which many of you have heard about, sort of legendary at this point. The snowpack went down to about 32% of normal, and there were 2 different biological opinions. In the upper basin, the Fish and Wildlife Service said the Bureau of Reclamation needed to leave enough water in the upper basin for the sucker species. The National Marine Fisheries Service in the lower basin said that the Bureau of Reclamation had to allow enough water to go down for the salmon species. The farmers are saying, don't forget us, we want our water. And again, the tribes were able to intervene in this biological opinion process, and what happened was the pretty historic thing was that the Bureau of Reclamation turned the water off, water curtailment, and 90% of the farms that were dependent on water from 90% of the farms that were dependent on this water were shut off, and $35 million lost farm income. So you can imagine this led to all kinds of conflict, and many of you have probably seen pictures, but there were death threats, very dramatic. There were 10,000 demonstrators on Main Street in Klamath Falls. There was sympathy from around the nation, even from around the globe. There was a makeshift bucket brigade where people took these jugs of water and passed them along and put the water into the canals to help to support the farmers and show their support for the irrigators. And some protesters even broke open the locks on the head gates and to one of the canals to let the water flow into the irrigation ditches, which is a federal offense, but the sheriffs refused to arrest them. So all kinds of mayhem. And then also and you can see here the kid called 911, some sucker stole my water, opened the head gates, a lot of flag waving, patriotism. And some of the people that came to the protest brought this big bucket, and it now still sits in front of the courthouse to symbolize the support that the community has for irrigators. It's still there. And it is, I think, an indication, too, of the political leanings of the local leaders. When you go to the county courthouse, there's this big bucket there that sort of is a memorial to what happened in 2001 and sort of how we hope this will never happen again. Some of the headlines and quotes from protesters that were in the papers, pretty interesting just to see the kind of rhetoric going on. There lots of sympathy for the irrigators, lots of blame on the endangered fish, and by extension on the tribes, a lot of hatred of the tribes, a lot of really horrible things said to them and actions against them. And I think it's certainly ironic that the irrigators are making claims of being victimized. There were these competing claims for marginalization. They felt like they were being treated like Indians because they were being excluded from the water resource decisions, and denied water. And so I think that this period, this right here, is a really important moment, indicative of these tribal and non-tribal power shifts going on that were beginning to take place in the basin. 2001 is kind of a wake-up call when people realized that the tribes really do have quite a bit of power, and that maybe they can't be as easily ignored as they had been in the past. Newspaper articles, New York Times covered. Now, I gave a talk about this in New Zealand a couple of years ago, and even people there had heard about this. They knew about the Klamath Basin. So the Bush administration response to this disaster was to send Gail Norton, Secretary of Interior, seen there by the head gate, and they sent her to turn the water back on about a few months after it had been turned off. So there's a big ceremonial display, lots of cheering, media coverage, and this was in spite of the fact that the biological opinions still were suggesting that it would not be a good idea to turn the water back on to the farms because of what might happen downstream. And sure enough, so 6 months later, the Bureau was directed by the administration to allow irrigation in 2002 for the 2002 season, in spite of these biological opinions that were still recommending curtailment. So in 2002, many of you have heard the story. I think some mentioned earlier. The irrigation in the upper basin resulted in inadequate flows to the lower basin, and you had this big mortality event, or depending who you are, it's a fish die-off or a fish kill, but it was an event that was disturbing to pretty much everybody. And 35,000 plus salmon died. Some figures are higher because of columnaris. I think you heard a little bit about these problems that salmon can experience in the lower basin earlier, crowding, stress, heat, like losing salmon people. And this also came back to haunt the fishing communities later, 4 years later, in 2006, when those salmon did not come back. The salmon that had been lost in 2002 did not go out and come back. And so the $16 million in damages to the fishing industry related to this. And so there was just this sense that there were these rotating conflicts, first the farmers, then the lower basin tribes, the upper basin tribes losing their sucker species, and just that there was a real sense of fatigue. And in the Klamath Falls Herald and News, an editorial, I think this nicely sums up sort of the feeling that people had after 2001. This growing realization that the business as usual approach to resolving the problems was not working. And he says, Felice Pass says, whether the measure used is the size of salmon runs, the state of the basin's water quality, or the amount of water flowing in the Klamath River Basin streams and rivers, the 20-year effort to restore the Klamath River and its fisheries has failed. Salmon runs now are at greater risk of extinction, fishing is more restricted, and water quality is more degraded than when restoration began in earnest 20 years ago. Most importantly, the dewatering of major Klamath tributaries has continued unabated during those 20 years. What is needed is an honest, practical, and hard-nosed assessment of failures as well as successes, and a probing analysis of why so much taxpayer money has been spent with so little positive impact. So all the solutions leading up to 2001 had all been sort of top-down, generated by the federal government, throwing lots of money, big 2002, big part of the Farm Bill, $50 million earmarked just for the Klamath in the 2002 Farm Bill to help with water conservation and getting people's irrigation systems more efficient. And a lot of these investments of time and money and energy, I think largely because they came from the top down and not from the bottom up, were not too successful, and because they weren't implemented in a coordinated way. And so for a number of reasons, I think this is a real turning point. Somewhere around 2002, 2003, after some of the wounds had started to heal a little bit from 2001, people started coming together, and you see the emergence of a whole bunch of little collaborative groups all over, especially in the off-project lands. I mean, my research is mostly around ranching communities, and so the ranching communities in the Sprague and the Williamson and the Wood, several little collaborative groups that came together that tried to bring together diverse members to work together on restoration projects and on problem solving. And these groups also, I think, contributed to the ability of the stakeholders involved in the FERC relicensing process to actually talk and be civil and get somewhere with each other. So these sort of collaborative local processes, including the FERC relicensing process, those talks, I think ultimately led to the KBRA. Like I said, I think I told you already enough about the FERC relicensing process, but that started getting going in 2006, 2008. And what it involved was formal monthly meetings between 28 key basin stakeholders regarding dam removal versus retrofitting for fish passage. So the Pacific Corps had to decide whether it was going to remove all the dams to comply with the Endangered Species Act or retrofit them to allow for passage. And of course, Pacific Corps at first didn't want to remove them, but a lot of economic analyses showed that actually it would make more sense financially to remove the dams. And these basin stakeholders were able to come together and present a united front to Pacific Corps and help them come to the conclusion that it would make more sense to remove the dam. So a whole bunch of things have had to fall in place also to convince Pacific Corps that it would be a good thing to do, like protecting them from any kind of liability when you remove the dams and the sediment issues and such. So there's all kinds of things that have had to come together, but the key thing was this group of people that had formerly been at odds with each other or didn't even know each other came together and presented a united front. That was a pretty key factor. It involved hundreds of informal side meetings facilitated by a local collaborative group. Really, Sustainable Northwest deserves a lot of credit for this. A few key individuals there were very good at getting people together on the side. You'd have these big meetings with everyone, but then it was very important to have meetings between key individuals on the side so they could work out their issues and then come back to the group and have those resolved. Very strategic, very targeted conversations along the side that I think were really helpful. The goal of this group is that so first you had the group that was just talking about dam relicensing. Then they morphed into the extended caucus, and they were supported by the Bush administration. The Bush administration was happy to see this group come together and start thinking more broadly about basin-wide solutions. They knew that just getting the tribes the water, or just getting the farmers their water, or just removing the dams, any of these single actions weren't going to solve all the problems. There needed to be a coordinated basin-wide approach. And so the Bush administration was very supportive of that, gave them all kinds of money and support and information that they needed in order to have these meetings about broader basin resolution. So they wanted to deal with water, power, dams, endangered species, tribal claims, everything all at once together. So they came up with the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, a draft in 2008, and then that went through a bunch of hoops, and then we finally just had the signing in February of 2010. So what does it involve? Just a little bit about the specifics, because it's pretty amazing that all these things got into this one document and everyone actually signed it. Well, not everyone. There are a few people that still are not happy with it. But most of the key stakeholders in the basin are on board with this, which is pretty amazing. But as far as ecosystems, you're going to have the largest dam removal in the history of the world. Salmon will be introduced to the upper basin after almost 100 years. You'll have guaranteed in-stream flows in the upper Klamath Basin for sucker recovery, and guaranteed water for the national wildlife refuges. So they're figuring all this out with all their water modeling and political agreements and figuring it all out, how to reallocate the water in a way that makes more sense. The irrigators will get, one of the things that's really been troublesome for the irrigators is being under the auspices of the Endangered Species Act, not having any certainty. So the irrigators get certainty as far as they have less water, but the water that they will get will be guaranteed, and you won't be able to touch it with the ESA or with biological opinions. So they'll know what they're going to get, and they'll know what they're going to get in advance, far enough in advance that they can plan for it. The way it is now, it's sort of this big surprise every year. How much water are you going to get? And they have to kind of struggle to try to adapt to that in a short period of time. So they'll have a safe harbor agreement to avoid liability for salmon recovery, which is really important, because once salmon come up, if they become endangered, then the landowners there might be liable for that. So they needed a safe harbor agreement to make them feel comfortable with salmon coming back. they have been offered, on a willing seller basis, the government will buy out irrigators in the off-project lands. They need to find 30,000 acre-feet of water in the off-project lands, which will involve retirement of irrigation on about 18,000 acres of land. That's probably one of the biggest sticking points in this whole KBRA is the resistance from the off-project landowners who feel like they're going to bear the burden here, and they're going to have to give up their way of life, their irrigation, their irrigated ag community and economy. But there is a lot of effort. There are a lot of efforts right now to try to help them figure out how they can give up find this 30,000 acre feet, but still maintain their ag communities and economies. And then the tribes, pretty amazingly, not only are they going to have assurances that there will be enough money and investments in water to help recover the fish species they care about, but also land. They've ever since they lost the reservation in the 1950s, they've been wanting to get that land back. And so the KBRA includes funding to help them purchase 90,000 acres of former reservation land as the Mazama Tree Farm, formerly owned by Fidelity. And so they also, along with that, will get money for economic development, including small-scale forestry and a biomass plant. And just to give you a sense, their reservation was about 1 million acres. This is just 90,000 acres. But in red there in the northwest corner is the Mazama Forest, and that will go to the Klamath tribes, and they can start doing some restoration forestry on there. They'll have a woody biomass plant. The restoration plan, I was inquiring about whether there was any explicit mention of TEK in their restoration plans, and I don't think that there necessarily is explicit mention, but I'm sure that it will come into play. And two of the key people that have helped them with their forest restoration plan are Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson here at OSU. Have worked very closely with the tribes to come up with a restoration plan that will get the forests back to a more resilient state, because they're in pretty bad shape right now. Also, this Tribal Forest Protection Act is pretty exciting because it was just passed in 2004. It authorizes the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior to allow tribally proposed projects on agency lands bordering or adjacent to Indian trust land. So if you're a tribe that owns some land, if you've got federal land next to you, you can propose to do restoration projects on there too, to kind of go across to do more of a transboundary approach. So the tribes are planning to do some restoration work in the Fremont-Wainema National Forest also. So I think this also signifies a real shift in power for the tribes, accessing land, water, potential restoration for fisheries. And there's a lot more to be said about the Mazama Tree Farm. In fact, Erin Kelly, who just finished her PhD here in Forest Ecosystems and Society, wrote in part about the Mazama Tree Farm and the deal with the tribes getting that back. It's an interesting story and what they're planning to do with it. So again, how did they get there? This is how I sum up. Like I said before, I think the laws are really important. The three big ones I think of are the Endangered Species Act, the Tribal Trust Responsibility, and of course the Federal Power Act, which forced the FERC relicensing process to take place. Also this formal process for bringing people together. And then the part, again, that I think is more interesting is these shifting tribal and non-tribal power relations and the relationship building at local and regional scales. So I'm going to show you this generalized model that I came up with depicting my view of shifting power relations between Indian tribes and irrigated ag interests in the Klamath Basin from the time of European American settlement to the present. So you can see here two concurrent and to some extent causally linked trends. The red line is the way I'm representing irrigated ag, and this is sort of the trajectory of the rise and fall of irrigated ag. I don't want to get anyone too upset about this idea of the fall of irrigated ag, but I do think that if you look at the power of irrigated ag interests over time, you can see very clearly when they came here in the mid-1800s, they had nothing, but through processes of deterritorialization, they got themselves some land. Through the support of the federal government, they established the irrigation project. They did some homesteading. They established vibrant agricultural communities and economies, and all the way up through the 50s. And I would say the 50s, you could argue the 50s was the real heyday for irrigated ag in the United States. Big dam era, a lot of dams in the United States went in the West, a lot of the dams in the West went in the 1950s, and crops were selling at good prices then, and it was a good time for agriculture in the 1950s. But for a number of reasons, since then, things have been not as good. I mean, of course, you've got dips and everything, but with the globalization of agriculture and neoliberal policies and growing problems related to the environmental legislation passed in the 1970s that constrain what they can and can't do. And what else? Rising land prices, making it more difficult to purchase land to do agriculture on, gentrification of some of these lands they work on. A lot of these things have conspired to put them in a more vulnerable position. So, and at the same time, the tribes, in sort of a parallel universe here, started out having a pretty nice life before the European Americans came along and convinced them to give up some of their land, almost all of their land, basically. And all kinds of things happened, of course, as you know, if you know the tribal history, Indian history, Native American history in the United States. But with the Allotment Act later on in the 1800s, so the 1864, they lose their land and get put on a reservation. Then the Allotment Act, they lose even more. The Dawes Act, they lose even more land, and it allows white settlers to come and move in onto their reservation. And then the Nadir, obviously 1950s with termination, and loss of not only their land but tribal status. I think that was a real blow, was just to not even be able to call yourself an Indian anymore and to just be a U.S. citizen. So, but I think for a number of reasons, things started to turn around in the 60s, more the 70s. A lot of really important Supreme Court cases passed in the 1970s that started to realize and force people to recognize the tribal trust responsibility in these hunting and fishing treaty rights, for example. Important cases having to do with the Columbia and in the Klamath also, the Adair cases that came about saying, yes, the tribes do have water rights, and yes, they are from time immemorial, and so yes, they trump all the water rights in the basin. Those decisions started coming down in the 1970s, and of course with the ESA being passed in the 70s, and then the listing in the 1980s of the suckerfish, it was becoming inevitable that people were going to have to start listening to the tribes. So this is just a very generalized diagram, but I think that it helps me understand how these shifting power relations have taken place. But in 2001, you saw these two trajectories coming together. The tribes have more and more legal power, but the irrigators still have quite a bit of political and cultural power. They may not have as much legal ground to stand on with some of their arguments about that they should have the water, but they're still very powerful politically and culturally. And so there were these sort of back and forth wins and losses. If you think of 2001, the tribes won and the fish won, but in 2002, the tribes lost and the fish lost and the irrigators won, and just a lot of back and forth and no real solutions, nothing really getting resolved, just sort of a process of zero-sum games. And then, as I've told the story, for a number of reasons, just sort of, let's just figure this out on our own. We'll do a bottom-up process. We'll all get together. We'll tell the feds to move out of the way, tell Pacific Corp to move out of the way. We'll get the 28 key people in one room. We'll sort this out ourselves. And that has so far seemed to be a pretty promising approach. And so what I think is most interesting is trying to explain that transition. How did exactly that come about? So that's where my research mostly is. So I argue that, so let's see if I want to make sure if I say. So I think that the zero-sum games. Yeah, there was the whole series of ADR-type processes and roundtables and listening sessions and trust building and other factors which could comprise a whole book were really interesting. And so there's a lot that's being left unsaid here when you go from the back and forth to the smoother trajectory there. So one of my interviewees explained this transition and the movement towards the KBRA in terms of shifting power relations as well, but he talked about it in terms of vertical versus horizontal approaches to conflict management. I think this is a really nice quote. He says, "To me, the big change is the change from, if you're an irrigator, you can solve this problem. Simply go up your chain of representation without ever intersecting with your neighbor. That if you go up your chain of representation, you can get DC to send back down your solution. So you're in a purely vertical process. And what I think has been changing is that the process by which solutions are ostensibly developed is becoming much more horizontal. But I don't think it means that people didn't recognize the tribes were powerful or they didn't give them legitimacy. I don't see it that way. I think what they thought is, oh, we can solve this without them. All we need to do is do our vertical work really well, and then we'll have enough power to minimize their power. And that just didn't work. So, and I think this sort of shift is happening in places other than the Klamath Basin. This recent High Country News cover is an example of the tribes' increasingly difficult to ignore assertion of rights to scarce water in the West. It says, for almost a century, the Navajo tribes the Navajo tribe has been left out of the Colorado River water game. Now they're ready to play their hand. And so what that means is, if you read the article, technically and legally, they can claim all the water in the whole Colorado River Basin. This is based on a different type of Indian water rights, the Winters Doctrine, and potentially irrigable acreage. So technically and legally, they could claim all the water in the Colorado, which is ironic considering that many people on the reservation don't even have running water. So that just shows they've got this incredible legal power, but they have not been able to realize that legal power for all these the number of reasons that you can imagine. So realistically, there will be some sort of compromise, but some water will go to the Indians at the expense of non-tribal water users. That's just the way it's going to be. There will be losers. There will be irrigators who will have to give up their water so that the tribes can have what is owed to them. So, and along the way, traditionally powerful water interests will be forced to the table to negotiate with the tribes. So you'll see, this is again an example of these new power dynamics. And I think you can see these trends all around the West. If you look at what's going on with Indian water rights settlements, I was trying to update this statistic about the number of settlements regarding Indian water rights that have been passed. I think it's certainly at least a few more. I think Des Paris, and then if you add Klamath to this, probably a little over 20 settlements regarding Indian water rights are pending. And there's this growing recognition that negotiated settlements are better than litigation. The Klamath tribes could have gone to court and said, we get all the water in the Klamath Basin, and the irrigators say, no, you don't, and the judge would have decided. But that's a really risky thing to do. And even if you do get all the water, if you're the tribes and you get all the water, what are you going to do with it? You don't have money to develop it. You don't have money to do the restoration. So there needs to be there's a growing realization that negotiated settlements are actually much more effective for everybody all around. So the current proposals for settlements exceed billions of dollars. And then most recently, the Obama administration's interest in recognizing tribal sovereignty and the need for rectification, I think, is really interesting and exciting. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who is the policy advisor for the National Congress of American Indians, and he works closely with the White House on policy issues affecting the tribes. And he told me how he went to a meeting recently where Obama was speaking to a group of tribal leaders, and he said, I know what it's like to be forgotten, and you will not be forgotten anymore. And my colleague, Jose, he really felt like there's this new reality in the Department of Interior now with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is under the Department of Interior, and Ken Salazar is the Secretary of Interior, and Larry Ecological is the Director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And historically, the BIA has been sort of the ugly stepchild, and the DOI hasn't gotten much attention and hasn't had a whole lot of power. But there's this whole new reality now, apparently in D.C., where Larry Ecological has carte blanche to meet with Secretary of Interior Salazar whenever he wants. And in fact, I think they meet weekly. And at a recent DOI meeting, Salazar was reported to say to the group, Larry Ecological is going to speak, and he can have as much time as he wants, which may not seem like a big deal, but if you're in a political meeting, you're in a big staff meeting, and you're the Secretary of Interior, there's a lot of other issues to be covered. He prioritized that the group needed to hear from Larry Ecological about tribal issues that the Interior needed to be aware of. So I think that's interesting and indicates a real shift. Having Obama in office, I think we'll continue to see greater recognition of tribal rights. And then shifting globally. I think that if you look globally, these types of power shifts and efforts at reconciliation are happening all over the world. This is the Australian example. National Sorry Day has actually been an Australian event held each year on May 26 since 1998, and it's to express regret over the historical mistreatment of Aboriginal peoples and the stolen generation. So Australia recently also officially adopted the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is 46 articles which outline Indigenous peoples' rights in international law. And Australia was one of the last few countries not to sign it. It was Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and one other who wouldn't sign it for many years. And so Australia signed in 2009 and reversed the decision of the previous administration, which in 2007 had voted against it. And what the officials now say is that this will reset the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So, and this is a question for somebody else to do the research on. Almost all the other countries in the world have signed on to this except for the United States. And I'm wondering, I think it's a really interesting question as to why. I mean, we do have some of the most progressive laws protecting the tribal trust responsibility in the world. Our tribal trust responsibility is pretty powerful. And the tribes in the West, like this, this Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, you wouldn't see anything like that in other parts of the world, having tribes being able to realize that much power. So it's an interesting conundrum to me. Why wouldn't we want to say? I mean, I think there was something a few years ago where I don't know, Secretary of Interior had said sort of a mild sorry, but it wasn't official, and it wasn't a signing of anything official. What was it? Yeah, it was sort of like, we feel bad that we did this to you, but it's not an official apology, is what they said. But even with all the right laws and institutions, I maintain that local tribal and non-tribal relations, this rectification and saying sorry at a person-to-person scale, are really critical to moving forward with collaborative environmental governance. The people have to be able to talk to each other. And so in my research, I focused a lot on the shifting power relations at the micro level. And a lot of great quotes regarding changing relationships between tribal leaders in the Klamath and then also the basin irrigators. But I'm thinking that I probably don't have much time to go into those. So I think I'm going to skip over to just summarize that there have been a number of processes and events cultivated that have cultivated a more collaborative, trusting spirit and effective alliances between fishermen, tribes, NGOs, irrigators. NGOs working on hydropower reform in particular have been really instrumental in helping the tribes raise their profile. And for example, there's some really effective rallies that went on. Berkshire Hathaway, owned by Warren Buffett, now owns Pacificor. And so at two of the recent shareholders meetings, a group of commercial fishermen and lower basin tribal members and some NGO folks went and rallied at the Berkshire Hathaway headquarters there with their canoe, and they had a salmon cook-off, and they made lots of noise, and it really created quite an impression on the people who were there. I mean, the thousands of people there at the annual stockholders meetings. Same thing in Scotland. Before Warren Buffett, before Berkshire Hathaway bought Pacificor, it was owned by Scottish Power, and so this similar group of tribes and irrigators and commercial fishermen went to Scotland and rallied at this Scottish Power meeting, and they got attention from the press. The press framed it interestingly as saying the dams must come down, the salmon must be restored. This is an international human rights issue. So they were able to access a lot of power and media attention through these strategic alliances. I think part of the trip was paid for by the California Hydropower Reform Coalition. So some interesting alliances between NGOs who know about the strategies of how to get things done and how to challenge laws, and then the tribal trust responsibility being there as something to work with. So just some very strategic and effective alliances that came together. So as you can see here, I mean, so I have lots of quotes like these that I was going to get into, but we don't really have time. But these sort of insightful looks at how ecosystem restoration is really connected to social healing and restoration. So one rancher here says, what's happening here now is the maturing of people building relationships with one another, and to me that's what changes the environment. When farmers wrote letters of support for the fishermen, something changed. It can work here. So I think that sort of you have to look at the macro level, what's going on with the global indigenous sovereignty movement, and what's going on in Australia. That's probably affecting what's going on here. And then there's the regional perspective with all the negotiated water settlements going on in the West. There's the national perspective with the way the ESA is being implemented. But then this micro level, I think without the ranchers and the tribal leaders talking to each other and developing some trust and wanting to sit down together, a lot of this would not have happened. So I think that's is a good argument for future research that's kind of uses these mixed methods of qualitative research and document analysis. And there's still a lot more, obviously, to learn about what's happening there. So in conclusion, the future of the KBRA certainly is still uncertain. There's still a number of difficult and contentious steps related to funding and legislation before it will go through. But there's a lot of optimism that it will go through because there's so much bipartisan support of this, and there has been through the Bush administration and into the Obama administration. But what's interesting is we're already seeing, even without those formalized institutions of the KBRA in place yet, we're already seeing the benefits from the processes that led up to it. You see now, many of you probably know that the Klamath Basin is going into another year of really severe drought. Governor announced a state of emergency because of the drought. It's a very similar drought situation to what happened in 2001. So it's an interesting test case. Well, what will happen now in terms of social relations and social conflict as the summer heats up and there's the risk of curtailment? There will be curtailment. So what will happen in terms of how people relate to each other and get through those issues? So there's been a lot of discussion down there about how the management plan in the KBRA, if it had already been enacted, would have reduced the problems. And there's a lot of thought that it would have allowed for more coordinated response. It would allow for having preserved the water in a way that would prevent this shortage in the summer. Certain approaches to water allocation throughout the year could have been improved if it was under the same management plan that's in the KBRA. And also a major indication of completely transformed tribal, non-tribal social relations. And again, I have to say, this is between the leaders. The tribal leaders and the leaders in the irrigated ag community have come together and had a lot of progress. You have to remember that the people that they lead, many of them are not convinced. So it's not like everyone's singing Kumbaya together. That's going to take a lot of time for the irrigators, the larger community of irrigators and larger community of tribal members to get on board with this if they ever do. Because there's a lot of old hatred to be overcome. But the tribes have offered public support to disaster relief measures to help farm families through the season, which I think is really interesting. And the tribes are showing support for the irrigators in other ways. Here's a quote from Leif Hillman, director of the Karuk Natural Resource Department. He says, "Hopefully we can get the Klamath restoration agreements enacted by Congress this year and avoid a crisis like this in the future. Until then, tribal and fishing communities will need to support our neighbors in farming and ranching as they brace for a year of economic hardship." I think that's pretty amazing to have a tribal member say that they want to support their neighbors, the farmers and ranchers, their neighbors, to help them get through this water short year. So in sum, I think the Klamath case illustrates the critical role that social capital and community capacity play in transition to a more resilient system, and also the growing recognition of indigenous sovereignty, the necessity of including tribes in decision-making. But also, above all, we can't forget there is this very important role of formal institutions that mandate cooperative and collaborative approach, like this FERC relicensing process. So it's an interesting mix of the social relations, but also that legal framework and the right forum. And I think those things together have led to a pretty interesting moment in history with the KBRA. So I'll leave it there. But so any questions?
I'm curious, in terms of your research, do you focus on water issues globally, perhaps? And if so, or if your knowledge of the general subject would allow you to comment on the role of these micro and macro levels in dealing with the privatization of the commons, specifically water resources globally?
So what, in terms of like dams or what, privatization of water supply, or what are you mostly, what do you?
Primarily the privatization of the water supply that's has occurred in Africa and elsewhere, but also now in the developed world, where these corporations, particularly French corporations, are controlling water supplies.
And so your question is, are there grassroots efforts to fight back against that are successful, or to collaborate or negotiate? Or
Exactly.
Not that I know of. I've heard about all these issues, and it's really disturbing in Chile and Argentina too, isn't it? Where there's a lot of trouble there with that. I don't know. I feel like this is a great example of incredible tribal capacity, and I don't know to what extent that exists in other places. I mean, the Chipko movement, there are examples of indigenous peoples coming together and being incredibly effective with protesting dams, for example. But I don't know of any related to that, the privatization of water thing. So I'm actually, we might be interested, I just submitted an article for a special issue of Water Alternatives it's a special issue looking at the World Commission on Dams 10 years later. So they've collected about 30 articles that have to do with large dams all around the world, looking at what's going on with large dams in all these different geographic contexts, and how, in terms of what's happening with large dams and to what extent do the principles that were outlined in the World Commission on Dams report in 2000, to what extent are those being realized currently. And so I was able to tie what's happening now in the Klamath Basin to some of their principles and say, yes, actually, a lot of the ideas that they had in 2000 about how dams had to be managed in ways that dealt with not just economic and ecological issues, but also social issues and human rights issues. The Klamath offers a nice example of a process that it's a pretty functional and healthy process towards deciding about the fate of a large dam. So that should be a good issue, though. There'll be stories from all over the world about people trying to make dam decision-making and management more socially and ecologically sustainable.